stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
Well, today is another wonderful, beautiful day here in Montana, and I am excited to introduce my podcast guest for today. His name is Dominic Vogel, and we met on LinkedIn. I shared a post on LinkedIn about a podcast that I had recorded, and it was one of those promotions for one of the episodes that I'd recorded. And he commented on it and then said, "I'd make a great podcast guest. You should reach out to me." And then the hashtag was, "Sometimes I'm funny." And normally I would have totally ignored that introduction, because normally when I see something like that, I just get annoyed. Like, just reach out to me, just send me a personal message and build a relationship with me. But the hashtag totally caught my attention. So I clicked on your profile and I read through it and I thought, okay, this could actually be really entertaining. So Dominic, thank you so much for introducing yourself and for agreeing to spend some time with me today to record this podcast.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me. I'm just looking forward to an awesome combo with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were just discussing where we live. We're both in the Rockies. I'm in the Montana Rocky Mountains in the U.S., and he is in the Pacific West Rockies in Canada near Vancouver, right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I'm super close to the Rockies, but we're a pretty short drive away from them.
Just on the other side.
Yes, that's right. More ocean side. Yeah, continental divide.
Yes, and I did mention that I've been to Vancouver a few times and just loved it. It was beautiful there. So the first thing I'd like to ask is for you to share something about yourself that most people don't know. Something that wouldn't be on your resume or your LinkedIn profile. And I ask you this because I know we're going to get into some personal stories later in the recording. And I'd like for our listeners to have some context for who you are outside of what we talk about during the recording. So do you have something to share?
Absolutely. One of the things that very few people know about me is that when growing up, my mom really struggled with mental illness, and that was one of the, I'd say, defining moments of my childhood and well into my teenage years, and very much shaped who I am today.
Wow. Okay. And can you share what that was diagnosed and when?
Absolutely. I mean, with mental illness, this is going back 25 plus years, and where mental health awareness is now, very different than when it was 25 years ago.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And we still have
a long way to go.
A long way to go, and she's very much, I know the diagnoses have changed over the years, but again, it's very much marked by episodes of schizophrenia, paranoia, sort of extreme levels of paranoia, and just not knowing sort of what the world around her actually is. And it was something which there was good times, bad times, really tough times, but having to deal with that when I was very, very young, I remember that one was probably around 11 or 12 when that started to appear. And like I said, there's a lot of dark moments, but I wouldn't be who I am today had I not experienced that, and still experience that with her today.
Wow. Well, I definitely wouldn't have seen that in your profile, and I haven't seen that in any of the content that you
surprised you.
You did. Well, and in a good way. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't share that kind of information, and it's a very familiar way for me because my dad's bipolar started showing up when he was 40, and I was in my mid-teens. So I can really relate to that. And I have shared about that experience a little bit. So it's always an honor when somebody feels like they can share that. And it's also, I find it to be very courageous when somebody chooses to share that, because because we still have a long way to go when it comes to talking about mental health, but also because we have to understand that those experiences definitely shape us, and they shape our internal messages. What did I do to deserve this? Why did I make her so angry? It was my fault. And, all kinds of weird messages that we start to develop until we realize that it really had nothing to do with us.
Exactly, and there are so many great lessons over time that have come out from this. Being able to really tie down, and something which I believe in is the whole notion of empathy. And even my mom in her darkest moments, being able to be empathetic to her and understanding, and as much as you want to try and reason with someone who just is in a completely other world. Knowing about being empathetic, understanding, kind, compassionate, and seeing other family dynamics as well, in which through thick and thin, my dad never gave up on her, not once. And you see that in other families where, and I'm a firm believer in which one of the reasons why we see such high divorce rates is that we're in a society right now where people give up on each other. At the first sign of trouble. Again, there's legitimate, I'm not saying divorce is wrong, but I'm saying that I see that too often where we don't take the time to realize that if you truly love someone and truly care about someone, you never give up on them. And, so these are a lot of things which were instilled in me very early on, and qualities in which brought me into adulthood and very much into business as well, in terms of how I approach not just life, but business as well, from an empathetic point of view, and not sort of the take no prisoners approach that many do to business.
That's really interesting. One of the things that just popped into my head is the way that we all process these things differently and learn the lessons differently. And the reason I say that is you learned the sense of empathy. You learned being compassionate helps you feel better about how you're handling things. I can hear it in your voice that this has been true for you for most of your life, is that you already understand that about yourself. And I think for some people, like after my experience was kind of opposite, in that I learned to avoid certain things. Like when my father would have some sort of an outburst, I knew to just lay low and give him space, where other people in my family didn't seem to see which personality was walking through the door. Like I knew as soon as he walked through the door, okay, this is the dad that needs a space versus this is the dad that you can joke with or ask a question or a favor of. And other people in my family just didn't seem to be aware of that. And while I wouldn't call it empathetic, I think I developed keen observation skills. And,
Absolutely.
And I can be friends with people who have those struggles, but I knew that that's not what I wanted in a partner. And so I really was super observant about the men that I dated, because a couple of them were just like my dad. And it was what I was attracted to, because I loved my dad. He passed a few years ago, but at the same time, I didn't want to be married to my dad. So I learned some interesting lessons. So I really appreciate that you shared that, because it's a great premise to even continue in our conversation, that theme.
Absolutely, more and more it's something which during my earlier years, it was something I tried to suppress and not overtly communicate to many people. I mean, some of my closest friends don't really know the full extent of that as well, but over the past few years, realizing that is a key narrative of my life that I need to embrace more, and being able to leverage the platforms that I do have to sort of share those stories and realize that I'm not alone in having gone through that. There's millions of people who are in those who have either gone through that or going through it right now. And I'm a firm believer in being able to share our vulnerabilities to help strengthen others. So I appreciate you giving me this platform to do so.
Yeah, so that makes me wonder. Let's start kind of from later in life, when you realize that so much of who you are really came out of the lessons you learned as a kid. Do you remember a specific incident where you realized that, oh, I know how to handle this because I handled that, or because I have this evidence that says I can handle it?
Well, I'd say, especially in the past few years, I've had a lot of people, saying to me how they appreciate, and this is I think, a concept that you're talking about, was about emotional intelligence, being able to be emotionally cognizant of how to best deal with people. And, I keep hearing time and time again from people that one of the most endearing things that they find about me is, again, that people side, that who I am, that I'm very raw, authentic, and that there's a very strong trust factor that goes alongside with that. And that's core to my business. I'm in the business of being a cybersecurity advisor to small and mid-sized businesses, and trust is a core element of being a good advisor. So, as sort of I hear that more and more, I realize that, again, what I went through was very important in terms of morphing my brain and morphing myself in a way. And again, I've been trying to figure out, was I cognizant of that at the time? Because a lot of people, if things are going bad, there's sort of that fight or flight mentality. I could easily have gone down a more destructive path, but for whatever reason, and I'd like to give myself credit, but I don't think I intentionally went down the path of trying to learn from that. At least I didn't, not until later on in life. So I'm very fortunate that I think I've gone down this path. I'm sure there's an alternate universe somewhere where I may not have been so fortunate.
Yes. Well, I think that's an important aspect of all the stories in our lives, is that we generally don't know at the time that they're happening that they're going to have an impact.
Yeah.
Even the worst situations, we think they'll have an impact, but sometimes it ends up being much more minor than we could have anticipated, or something really that we think of as minor ends up being, one of the turning points when we look back at it. And I've said this many times in this podcast. I don't believe in light switches going on from off. Yep. They don't just flip on, flip off. They don't do that. I think in terms of life and the impacts that these experiences have on us, I always think of them more as a dimmer switch. But what's interesting is that you can be very close to that tipping point of turning it on full bright. And I use that term tipping point from Malcolm Gladwell's book, because I refer to it a lot. I read it probably over 10 years ago, and I still refer to that book. I should ask him to be on my podcast. That's so awesome. I love that.
I would watch that.
Yeah, I'm going to have to reach out. But when I think about, a certain series of events that lead to that tipping point, then you can really kind of look back for those lessons. But and I think a lot of times we don't intentionally use those lessons until we're aware of those tipping points. And I find that kind of sad that we can go through life using these great lessons, but not necessarily with intention, unless we externally process the things that happened so that we can use those lessons with intention and help others. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's such a great point. I think the piece to that is some which I've become more in tune with, is that as I go through, crises or, personal moments of doubt or what have you, realizing that everything that happened before served a purpose in getting to where I am now. So sort of having that wherewithal and saying, okay, I am going through this for a reason, and trying to see bigger picture, not just trying to survive and get through it, but trying to see, okay, because of this situation right now, what is a bigger play? Where's that bigger picture there? So it's been really very enlightening for me, I would say, to go sort of through this journey because I feel I am much wiser now, and I'm sure if you ask me 20 years from now, I'll feel even wiser then.
Gosh, I hope so.
I hope so. There's still so much more to learn, I feel.
Well, given that mindset, here's where I'd love to go next. Have you have you noticed that now that you have this mindset that I've been through this and it's led me to where I am now, that you can think about it in those terms when you're in the middle of it. Okay, what lessons am I here to learn? Did you recently have an experience like that? Because I can share one. It seems like yesterday, but it was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. I was in a job with a boss that was really hard on me.
Yes.
And the whole time we struggled, I would be thinking, what is my lesson? What is my lesson? What is my fucking lesson? Because my mom always said that these trials will just keep coming into your life until you learn the lesson from it. And the same person in different forms is going to keep coming into your life until you learn the lesson. And I remember like 2 years with this woman and going, come on already. I've learned so much, but clearly haven't learned the one thing that's going to release me from this lesson. And even to this day, I can look back and go, oh yeah, well, that was one of the big lessons. But I'm still learning lessons from that. And it was 7, 8, 9 years ago. Do you have that kind of?
Absolutely. There's been a lot of, I would say, checkpoints in my life, right, which have served those purposes. There's multiple I could share. The first one that I would share is during my final, what I refer to as my corporate days. So over the course of my career, the first 10 years of my career, I was basically in corporate world. I had this vision that I always wanted to be in charge of a cybersecurity team, that's what I would truly make me happy. And I worked diligently over 10 years to get to that point. And when I got there, and for that year in which I was in that role, I was so miserable. I was so sad, so upset, so jaded. And my loved ones could tell I was a different person. And then I realized, I thought, well, why did I work so hard to get to this point? And at that time, this happened 5 years ago, I left and I formed my consulting company, which over the past 5 years, that journey has brought me immense joy and happiness. And looking back now, that, some people have said, well, why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you start your consulting company sooner? And after having the time to think about it, I realized that I needed to go through that journey. There was so much I learned, even just from a sort of like a subject matter expert point of view. I needed to go through those corporate roads. I needed to sort of go through that year of personal suffering in a corporate role, which I was so upset with, because that's made me a better advisor. That's allowed me to be a better consultant and advisor with my clients. If I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't have those lessons learned. So it was, like I said, it was important, because without that, again, I'm not the what at least I feel to be the great advisor that I am, and would not have given me the foresight to be the type of cybersecurity thought leader that I see myself, and many see myself as well.
So you were saying that you really had to experience those things to be who you are now. And I was thinking you also had to experience grief for having worked that hard to get to that point and then hating it. You probably had to experience some grief before you could leave. You had to know that you gave it a good shot, that year and a half or however long you did that job, to make sure that you didn't grieve losing something that you had worked so hard toward. But I'm curious about a moment when now that you look back and you're in that year and you're having a really tough time, a moment that you realized it was time to leave, or that it wasn't what you thought it was going to be.
Yes.
You have one of those?
Oh, yes, I do. Yeah.
I bet you do.
I still remember it so distinctly, and it was funny in which I'd say that this led to a greater sense of self-discovery. So to start off, again, the moment, and again, I wouldn't say it was just one moment. I would say it was sort of the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes, there you go.
It was definitely building up to it. It just wasn't hey, I'm coming out of the blue, I'm going to quit and move on. No, it was building to that over probably 6+ months. And one day I'm someone who gets tied to my sense of purpose. And for anyone who's been in corporate, there are many corporate roles in which it seems like you go from one meaningless meeting to another, and at the end of the day, you question, what the hell did I actually get done today? And it was one of those days which I was in the middle of a meeting, and I just felt like it was completely pointless. And I thought, what am I doing here? I'm not making anyone's life better. How is my value being brought forth to help those, to help the public, help people? And after this meeting, it was just another completely useless meeting, which could have been an email. And I went back to my desk and I sat down and I said to myself, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit. So I called one of my friends who was a recruiter at the time, and he had been one of the people in my ear saying, you know what, you're getting hosed in corporate. You need to quit. You can get better work from a contract perspective. And so I called him and I said, you know what, I'm the only person who works in my family. I can't go home to my wife and say, I quit my job. There's no plan B. So he said, hey, you know what, there's actually a contract open right now. You can work from home. It's like twice the pay. It's yours. Let me connect you with the right people. And yeah, basically within the day, I had that opportunity. I put in my 2 weeks notice at my corporate job the day after, and that propelled me forward. Doing that contract allowed me to sort of build my advisory company in that first year, and I was able to move on past from that shortly thereafter. And it was, like I said, it was being cognizant of the fact that everything that I thought that I was, in which I thought I was someone who wanted to be in charge of a big team, charge for a big company, just be someone who just, puts his head down, does the work, didn't really think about himself as an extrovert. I thought of myself as someone who's very introverted. Over the past 5 years of this, what I refer to as self-discovery of who I really am, who I thought I was, wasn't actually who I was meant to be. And realizing that I genuinely love meeting and chatting with new people, that I love being an extrovert, that I love being able to talk about cybersecurity and why it's important for small and mid-sized businesses. And that I actually love being an entrepreneur. I don't like working for corporate. There's so many of these assumptions or things that I had assumed was true. And like I said, being very blessed and humbled over the past 5 years to be on this journey of self-discovery and being more in tune with who I was meant to be.
Isn't that funny that I think a lot of us go through that we have this image of ourselves in our future. And when we realize that image doesn't really fit us, especially because a lot of us have those years where we work toward it kind of single-mindedly without stopping to think, what's that actually going to look like when I get there? Yes. We're just so kind of single-minded on the journey. And while I think that's okay to a certain extent, I think it's also important to be paying attention to your changing thoughts about yourself. And I talked to Mark Bowden a couple times about that, the shifts that we make from being what we think we are to being what we actually find value in as humans, that metamorphosis of authenticity. And so I'd like to go back to that meeting, and it probably blends in with all the other meetings that were like that. But there had to have been something about that particular meeting, somebody in it or some topic that was being rehashed again, because that's what they do in those meetings, that really kind of triggered this aggravation to where I could feel it. It was like visceral for you,
yes.
that sensation as you walked away from that meeting going, I'm a productive person, and none of that was productive. So what was it?
Yeah, it was really, it's again, back to that building up to that point in which, and I think in this example as well, the old adage in which you don't leave companies, you leave the people you work for, and that was very much the situation there. It was another leadership meeting in which the person who I reported to, it was just more of the same, in which he was someone who spoke of action, spoke of doing the right thing, but his actions were the complete opposite. And I'm someone, even at that point in my career, I was someone who wanted to be just ruthlessly honest and authentic. And I could no longer sort of tolerate the political meandering of the organization and having to say the right thing rather than trying to do the right thing. Sort of being able to say, if we're going to talk to the executives, you have to say X. You have to say it in this way. You have to soften the blow. I was continually coached about, you can't just be honest with the executives. You have to say it to them in the right way. And that was sort of what the context of this meeting was. And like I said, that it was in that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because that also epitomized the fact that I felt that there were two versions of me. There was corporate me and there was real me. I'm proud to say that corporate me no longer exists. I buried him in the backyard.
I know where to find the bodies.
Yeah, that's right.
Were you being corrected in that meeting?
Yes. That's what, like I said, was the final straw, was that although I had felt that for a long time, that I couldn't be me, that I had to be a polished version or corporate me, I could no longer tolerate. And it was an area which I was trying to do things to help move the organization forward. I was doing TV interviews, and even on behalf of the organization. And again, even then, I was being told, hey, you know what, you can't say, like the word darn on TV. That's unbecoming of the organization. And
oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was corporate. It was just, like I said, taking the corporate mentality to the nth degree. And like I said,
they had a very specific brand that they wanted.
Exactly. And the thing was that as much as this organization talked about values and this is who we are, to me, what struck the core was the lack of authenticity. Writing values on a company wall is one thing. Unless you actually live by them, they ring hollow. And that's what happened, was that the values that the company said that they live by, I didn't see in practice. And that at the end of the day was what broke the camel, and what sort of broke my spirit, in which and probably a few months before, I would say what was a catalyst for this was that I came across this quote that said, "Don't push loyal people to the point of no longer caring." And the reason I had stayed for so long was I cared about the organization. I cared about the people I worked with. I cared about the people that we served. But after that meeting, I could feel it within my bones that I no longer cared. And I thought, I can't be in a spot where this is just a paycheck. At that point in my career, I was very in tune with my purpose and being able to do something that was meaningful to for the world and for the public. And when I literally felt that, I remember that feeling so vividly, that I just felt it draining out of my body, that because I no longer cared, I was a liability to the organization, and that I owed it to the people there and the people that we serve, that I couldn't stay in that function. I had to leave.
You know what I love about that story is I'm imagining you sitting in that room being corrected, probably relatively gently, because they knew that you were that you were important in there, that you were doing something that actually mattered to them. So they were probably correcting you relatively gently, but I'm imagining you sitting in that room, kind of gripping your fists under the table, listening and kind of grinding your teeth, just trying to get through it without saying something that you knew could be even more damaging.
It's almost like you were there, Sarah.
And then I'm imagining you walking back to your office and sitting down and kind of melting.
Yes. And
realizing that you couldn't separate your personal and professional lives anymore, that you couldn't be two different people. And the reason this is so visual for me and so important to share with our listeners is that we can't separate our personal and professional lives. And you said it as clearly as it could be said, which is, if you are writing down your values and spouting them but not living them, you're not in alignment, and there's no trust when you do that. And even though you're talking about corporate values, each individual in that room that could live with themselves was separating their personal and professional lives, or trying to. And eventually that will cause an eruption. It just will, inside a person. And it may be when you're dying, when you're in your 80s or 90s, when you realize that you didn't live your values. And that's why the people around you don't know who you really are. But it for you, it didn't have to erupt in the same way, because you already knew that it wasn't in an alignment, in alignment for you. And I'm visualizing you. Did you have a beard back then?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
This is the quarantine beard, so it's a bit
Okay.
it's a bit thicker. I try
fuzzy.
to keep it. Yeah.
and our listeners won't be able to see you, but I'm looking at this man with a dark beard, and I was imagining him with his beard even then. But I'm imagining you kind of melting, and not in a sad way, more in a resigned but empowered way.
Yes.
Like you were kind of, I'm sure that you had this, it was conflicting, but you knew what you had to do.
Exactly. It was a sense of relief. It was a sense of relief as well. Yeah.
And grief.
Yes, and grief.
And what's so important about this story is that we can feel all those feelings and still make the right decision.
That's so true. That is so true, Sarah. And that's the thing, which, like I said, I've tried to embrace that part of that narrative. And again, it took me a few years before I was willing to start sharing that, and again, embrace the fact that by embracing that narrative and trying to share that with others, at the end of the day, like I said, I feel a great sense of pride having gone through that, because I love my story. I love my narrative, and being able to, like I said, share that on platforms like your podcast. I know this speaks to people, because as interesting as I like to think my story is, it's not unique. People go through that, and so where we can have those commonalities and where people can relate to this, and if there's a sense of empowerment or sense of something that can come out of sharing that part of my story, that gives me a great deal of accomplishment and satisfaction, knowing that, again, there was a purpose to having gone through that part of my journey.
I love that for so many reasons. And the most important one is that idea that we can experience very similar experiences in different ways and still connect over them, and offer hope. But as my friend Trent Selbrate always said, hope is not a strategy. So beyond hope, it's also, like you said, the word empowering, to hear that other people have had an experience like this and gotten through it. And I always come back to looking again to that evidence from your past that speaks to you, that you can say, I lived through that. I can live through this. I found a way to make beauty out of that. I can find a way to make beauty out of this. And those lessons that we learn to make us who we are, and then sharing them with others. I truly believe that when we do that, when we share these specific instances of our experiences, our feelings, what we see, what we experience in that moment, when we share those and we bring a person with us on that journey, that they can learn these lessons with a little bit less struggle than we had to learn them. I mean, everybody has to struggle to really learn them, but I would like to think that other people can hear these stories and feel empowered by them to make their own changes before that eruption occurs, because change is going to happen. And I would rather be driving it than for somebody to create change in my life externally.
That was pure poetry in motion there. that to me, and the best way, the only thing I could really add to that, like you were saying there, zeroing in on the fact that none of us are truly alone. There's a shared human experience here, and this whole notion that we have to be polished or perfect. I mean, it's a whole thing I'll refer to as the Instagram culture, in which you don't. That's not real. The people that I gravitate towards the most, and the people who gravitate most towards me, it's about embracing, just being real, being you, being authentic, being raw, sharing those vulnerabilities. Because at the end of the day, we all go through vulnerable stuff. We all go through troubles. We all go through tribulations, and when we can share those, we are connecting at a far deeper level than just talking about, what's your favorite sports team, or hey, how about the weather today? The deepest connections you can make are through our shared vulnerabilities.
And I think it's also really important to know that when we're sharing our stories, it is important to share the painful parts and the struggle parts. I think it's also important to share that as a small part of our story, and share the lessons and the growth as the larger part of that story. I think some people get stuck on the struggle part, and they spend 90% of the story talking about the struggle and only 10% of the story talking about the recovery or the solution or the growth. And I think if we're going to adjust our stories so that we get empowered by them, so that we see the beauty in those struggles, we have to switch that ratio. It has to be 10 to 20% the struggle, so that you can connect with somebody, so they know you're living it and that you have lived it. But then the rest of the story, the other 75%, it needs to be how you recovered, the evidence that you gained of your own resilience through that experience.
That's so well said. And to me, it's almost fallen into the approach in which, when you watch sort of movies that focus on underdogs, everyone loves a good underdog story. And to me, the first bit is seeing the vulnerability, seeing the weakness, or them at their lowest point. Vast majority of the movie is focusing on, again, how do they recover? How do they reach great levels of greatness through that journey? And then being able to say, here was that outcome. Here is from going from the struggle to the outcome and the journey in between. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's about making sure that we weave the right narrative, because you're absolutely right. We're just dwelling on the negatives, or the downsides of things. We're just being energy sucks. And at the end of the day, we want to be sending out great positive vibes and operating on a positive frequency.
Absolutely. Dominic, this has been so great. This was a wild card. Every once in a while, I have one of these wild card interviews where I just really don't know where it's going to go or what to expect. And this was one. And I am so grateful for the time that you've spent chatting with me about this, starting with discussion on mental health and how far we still have to go, but how far we've come in the last 30 years. And I'm just really grateful that you took this time and that you reached out to me in a unique way to offer to be part of this podcast.
I'm humbled for the opportunity, Sarah, and just keep up the awesomeness. I'm a big fan of your podcast and everything that you're doing. So keep up the great work.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And for our listeners, in the blog post associated with this podcast, I will have Dominic's LinkedIn profile link so that you can connect with him if something in his story really resonated with you, and the website to his consulting services so that you can learn more about what he does to help companies be more cyber secure, because clearly that's going to get to be, it's always been an important area of trust for corporations and businesses. But now, boy, we are on a totally different trajectory over the next at least 6 months, but probably for the foreseeable future. So thank you again for joining me.
Thanks, Sarah. Have a great one. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away? Don't say